We're going hopping today, where things are popping. The Philadelphia way, we're gonna drop it. On all the music they play on the bandstand. We're gonna swing it, we're gonna swing in the crowd. And we'll be clinging, and floating high as a cloud. The phones are ringing, my mom and dad are so proud. I'm on bandstand, and I'll jump and hey, I may even show my handstand. Because I'm on the American Bandstand.
From the War Room, it's America's Morning Show with Quinn and Rose, 1-800-507-1047. Dick Clark dead at 82. I think it was a shame that he did that one New Year's Rockin' Eve after he had his stroke, because he just really wasn't ready for television. I really didn't want to remember Dick that way. I met him in Dayton, Ohio in 1960-something or other when he did a Shower of Stars there, and I was working for WING, and we were we were up on stage. Nice guy. I mean, he was the nice guy that you thought he was. Dick Clark was just a really swell person. At least he was great to us. And granted, we were only with him for a few hours, but it seemed to be just the same guy he was on TV. You know, the story of Dick Clark, it's a kind of a weird story. Once upon a time, and I'm doing this from memory, so if I get anything wrong here, don't bomb me with emails. I'm doing this from memory. Once upon a time in Akron, Ohio, there was a white guy disc jockey by the name of Alan Freed. And the big bands were gone because of the 10% entertainment tax. And so consequently, a lot of the music of that era was really kind of yuck. Perry Como and K-Star and Peggy Lee and all that. And so Alan, realizing that the baby boom generation in the early 50s and mid-50s was coming of age. They were coming of puberty, which means they were going to start to listen to music. I mean, music is about romance. So he started hanging around the record stores. Now, back in those days, record stores sold guitars and pianos. They were called music stores, and they had auditioning booths. So you could tell what the kids were buying because they would come in and they'd ask for a record, go into the booth, and they'd listen to it in the booth and then decide whether they wanted to buy it or not. So Alan began to notice that these kids were listening to R&B, which at the time was called race music because none of the white stations would play it. Groups like the Moonglows, the Flamingos, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, just off the top of my head, the Valentines, and record labels like Apollo and Chess and Checker. These little record labels that, a specialty that nobody really heard about. Ember Records, out of which would come In the Still of the Night by the Five Satins, which, of course, is still one of the most haunting love songs. Anyway, Alan decided to start playing this stuff on the air, and it became a sensation. So WJW in Cleveland decided to pick him up. They moved him up to Cleveland to do a show from 10 until 1 at night. And in Akron, his show was called The Moondog Show, apparently because WJW was heard in Akron. The station didn't want him to take the name. So he had to come up with a new name for his rock and roll show, and that's what he called it, the Alan Freed Rock and Roll Show. Well, his manager, who I think is still alive, his manager said, Alan, you can't call it rock and roll because in black parlance, that means having sex. Alan said, I'm going to call it rock and roll anyway. And the rest is history. It was a sensation. One day, and his first rock and roll show in Cleveland, I think, was at the Cleveland Arena, which probably isn't even there anymore. And there were just thousands of people there, and everybody there was black. And Alan was just walked out on the stage, and they were stunned that this white disc jockey was playing all this music. But it was this was happening actually all over the country, and it was beginning to spread to the white kids. In Dayton, Ohio, there was a guy, what's his name? Gene Berry. In Buffalo, I think the guy's name was Moondog. In Pittsburgh, it was Porky Chedwick. But all across the country, this was beginning to pop up. White kids were starting to dig on this on this R&B stuff, Mickey and Sylvia, and all these R&B groups that the white stations wouldn't play. And I remember when me and my friends out in Jersey discovered it, we had to listen to like WNJR in Newark with guys like Daddy Sears and who was it? Danny the Catman Styles. WAAT in Newark, Raymond Bruce, Jocko on WOV, WLIB in Harlem. That's where we had to hear it. But then, one day, Alan Freed showed up in New York at WINS, and things started to mainstream because that was a quote-unquote white radio station. And all of a sudden, the white groups started to cover the black groups. Like At My Front Door by the Eldorados was the hit, but Pat Boone did it on the white stations. The first real crossover that actually broke the barrier was Earth Angel by the Penguins. But to make a long story even longer, he went from WINS to WABC in New York. In the meantime, Mitch Miller, do you remember him? The Yellow Rose of Texas. Remember, Mitch Miller had a goatee? Well, he was running Columbia Records, and he was getting angrier by the day because his stuff wasn't selling. And he was convinced that the teenagers were all buying this stuff on these crummy record labels like, Specialty and Chess and all these labels, VJ, nobody had ever heard of. And it made him mad because he was, after all, Columbia Records, and this was quality music, damn it. And so he became convinced that the reason why the kids were buying R&B was because the DJs were being paid to play it. Payola. Which, I can tell you from 50 years in radio, if you play a bad record over and over again, you're not going to get anybody to buy it. If it ain't a hit, you're just going to piss off the audience the more you play it. But anyway, he was convinced that it couldn't have been the fact that his music sucked, which, by the way, it did. So he goes to the government. And the government, of course, opens up these payola trials. Well, everybody was taking payola back then. I don't even think these guys knew that it was wrong. I don't even think that to them it was like a gratuity. You go out to lunch with a record guy, he pulls out a couple of records, says, hey, Alan, can you give me a couple of spins here? Here's $20, a little spiff. And see, because in the radio, now this happens in businesses today all over the country, but there's no law against it, exactly. But in radio, if you take money for something you put on the air, it has to be written down on a program log as commercial. And if it isn't, if it appears on the air and there's no notation that money has changed hands, I mean, if you were to put it on the log and say, I played this record and I took X amount of dollars for it, you'd probably get away with it. But nobody even thought about that. And I don't think these guys really understood that what they were doing was wrong. But along comes the payola investigations, and now ABC has got a choice. They have two hot properties. They've got Alan Freed, who literally invented the term rock and roll, and for whom the Rock and Roll Museum in Cleveland should be named, but it's not. And at that Rock and Roll Museum, the actual music that Alan coined the term about gets very short shrift. And I can't figure out exactly why. It's got to be political. I don't know the history of the Rock and Roll Museum. I was one of those people pushing to put it in Cleveland because of Alan Freed. Anyway, so here's ABC. They got the payola investigations are steaming. And they got Alan Freed, who's on the radio. And then they've got a guy in Philadelphia. A young, good-looking, vital young man who is clean as a whistle, and they're really glad about that because the guy that preceded him got brought up on a morals charge. I forget his name. Was it Horn or something? I forget his name. But this guy's name was Dick Clark, and he had a show called Philadelphia Bandstand where the kids from, was it Northeast High School or was it Roosevelt? I forget which. Would come after school and they would dance. And of course they became stars and the show was, they were getting ready to go into syndication. They were going to change it from Philadelphia Bandstand to American Bandstand. So ABC had a choice. They had to throw somebody to the wolves. So they threw Alan Freed to the wolves. And one of the things, I've heard this and I've heard it from multiple sources, but one of the things that made ABC throw Alan Freed to the wolves and not Dick Clark was Dick Clark took payola too. But he claimed it on his income tax as a gratuity. He actually claimed it as income on his income tax return. Now, that's the story I get. But the bottom line is Dick Clark goes on to be an American icon, and Alan Freed was fired. And last I heard, he went to Florida. By then, Top 40 Radio had become formalized by a guy named Todd Stewart, very highly produced, and then Alan was in kind of a dinosaur by then. The independent disc jockey with his own bag of records who comes in with his own act, and that was out the window. And the last, now what I heard was that he died of cirrhosis of the liver after a lot of heavy drinking and stuff, became an alcoholic. A sad end for Alan Freed because he's the guy that that did indeed invent rock and roll. Anyway, so there you have the story, for whatever it's worth. We have an energy heads up coming up. Your calls, too. Stand by. We'll be right back.